This is Of Men and Dragons, Book 1, Jack's Landing, Chapter 23 by DrBlackJack21. Telron turned to Shahar, his face expressing his deep concern.
I don't know much about humans, but I can't believe that kind of laughter is normal.
Jack continued to cackle gleefully as he started up the chainsaw. The roar of the engine caused Telron to jump back in surprise. He was starting to regret his earlier decision to help out Jack and Shahar. Dragon's magic was clearly something that shouldn't be meddled with. Their request hadn't seemed so frightening when they'd asked for help. Jack and Shahar needed a hand hauling freshly cut trees over to where the woodworkers could ply their trade, namely splitting and shaping logs into boards and planks. With all the tools sharpened and ready, there wasn't much for the smith to do at the moment, so Telron had volunteered his services. He'd assumed Shahar would cut the trees down. Jack would trim off the branches and he'd haul the wood. He hadn't known what to think when Shahar had laughed a little nervously at his assumption. In Jack's hands, the chainsaw roared as if it was some wild beast claiming its territory, drowning out almost all other sounds. The only thing he could hear over the cacophony was Jack's clearly unstable laughter. Telron expected Jack to swing the monstrous device at the tree like a woodcutter's axe. Instead, he seemed to leisurely brush against the tree with the lightest of touches. Immediately, the shredded wood began to fly everywhere as the tree was torn into pieces before Telron's eyes. In short order, the tree was on the ground, and Jack was trimming off the branches. As he worked, Shahar showed Telron how to attach the harness they were going to use to move what was left of the tree. Jack's laughter had died down at some point in the process, but the grin on his face still spoke of the dangerous imbalance in the man's psyche. Telron dragged the tree back to be processed and was greeted by a somewhat confused Feyen.
Already? You can't just bring back a tree you found lying on the ground. We'll need fresh wood to get good quality lumber.
Telron shook his head. Try as he might, he couldn't forget what he'd witnessed.
This tree was standing with all its branches attached not 20 minutes ago. Jack used a weird blade covered in metal teeth to chew the tree down and sever its limbs. He said it was powered by dragon's fire. After witnessing it in action, I believe him.
Telron started to head back after getting the log situated, only to pass Shahar, who was already pulling another log back to camp. The rest of the morning passed much the same. Jack would cut and trim a tree, while either Telron or Shahar caught their breath. Once cleaned, they dragged the trunk back to camp. By lunch, Feyen had asked them to stop. Otherwise, the trees would sit too long before being processed. The three of them had cleared away a decent amount of land by that point anyway. One thing that astounded Telron even more than the amount of work done was how well the chainsaw's metal teeth held up. Given how small they were and how much wood they'd been used to cut through, he expected them to be worn down to nubs, but when Jack allowed him to examine the tiny blades, they were still almost as sharp as any blade he could forge. The dragon obviously had some method of steel refinement that surpassed anything known to Argun. When Telron asked about it, Jack started his explanation with a shrug. Well, I don't know anything about it, but it's not just steel, it's an alloy, similar to combining copper and tin to make bronze. This is mostly a high-carbon steel, but a few other things like chromium and nickel have been added to turn it into an alloy. Because of the high carbon content, it's stronger than more traditional steels, and the other ingredients make the metal more resistant to rust and erosion. Telron was able to follow most of the explanation, though he didn't know what chromium was. From the context, he assumed it was a kind of metal similar to steel, but this steel Jack spoke of was amazing. He'd seen it in action. Telron was inclined to believe Jack's claims, improbable as they might seem. He was now even more eager to work with Shahar and the crazy human, and wondered what secrets he might bring back to his people after his time here. Jack and Shahar finally headed back to the ship before lunch. Everyone was eating leftovers from the night before, but Jack wanted to check in on Angela and Embro. They walked in on what was apparently another ongoing physics lesson. Angela was wearing a lab coat with thick glasses and also had grown her hair out, just to put it into a messy bun. For the lesson she was currently teaching, she had created a holographic box in front of herself as a prop.
So, as you can see,
Gravitational force keeps this box in contact with the ground. The friction force from that contact keeps it from moving on its own. But if I use applied force, I can move the box like so. Angela then seemed to push the box a short distance. Embryl seemed a little bored at the moment.
But why does it matter which forces cause this thing to happen? Why bother to name them? We all already know the box won't move unless someone moves it.
Angela had obviously fielded such questions before and was ready for it. These are just basic examples designed to give you an understanding of the nature of various forces, but once you understand them, you can apply them. For example, take a look at one of Shahar's throwing spears compared with one of Lanthal's spears. An image of two spears appeared in the air beside one another. If you notice, Shahar's spear, often called a javelin, is much smaller and lighter, and the front is more narrow. These qualities decrease the effect of gravitational pull and wind resistance, allowing the spear to travel further and more accurately. Shahar tilted her head to one side.
Huh, so that's how it works. And here I thought it was just because your steel was better than ours.
Angela shifted her attention to her new student. That is undoubtedly a factor. It's part of the reason the spears are so much lighter than what you are used to, but are still strong enough to withstand the impact and retain their shape. The trick is to make it light enough to throw well, but heavy enough to impart enough kinetic force upon impact to do some damage. Shahar was scratching her head.
You lost me. I don't know what energy has to do with my spear. I just throw it, and it stabs into my target. There's no energy.
Jack could tell by the light in Angela's eyes that this meant they were going to be here a while, since she now had two willing victims. Jack repressed his sigh as he set out preparing lunch. After finishing lunch, Jack and Angela were discussing what the next step should be. Angela began the discussion. Well, if the woodworkers have all the wood they can use for a few days, our next priority should be to increase our power reserves. I've already got some solar panels put together and ready to go, and the cable won't take me too long to finish. The problem is where to set them up. Jack nodded, gulping down a mouthful of sandwich in the process. Yeah, our cave entrance is facing the east more or less, but given our position in the northern hemisphere, we'd ideally like them to be on the southern face of the mountain. That way you can adjust the panels to face the sun for the entire day. But that would be a long way to run some cable. Angela seemed a little put out that Jack more or less bypassed her next excuse for more teaching, but let it slide. This time. Yes, it would be too long, which is why I want to dig a new access tunnel. A projection of the mountain appeared in the air above the table before Angela continued her explanation. So, we have natural tunnels already extending only a few thousand meters from the southern face here. The mountain turned translucent, and a glowing tunnel appeared on the inside. It looked more like string than the large, cavernous tunnel Jack knew it to be. Angela pointed at a few sections of rock, and they turned blue at the points she indicated. If you dig here, here, and here, you can extend our own tunnel to have nearly direct access, without compromising the cave's structural integrity by any noticeable measure. Jack was looking closely at the map when Embryl voiced her own question.
What's a solar panel?
Jack didn't have to see Angela to know her eyes were lighting up at the new question. To understand that, you first have to know what electricity is. Jack leaned over and whispered to Shahar, We might want to get back to work. This explanation is going to take a while. Shahar nodded her head emphatically, and the two left Embryl to her fate as Angela launched into a new explanation. Lonthal was stalking his prey, but wasn't having much luck today. Usually he could sneak right up on a churlish and pounce on it before it was able to so much as sense his presence. He'd been able to do it for years now, but for some reason, today, the churlish kept sensing him and jumping away before he could launch his attack. This had happened so many times that he'd chased it several miles around the mountain. Of course, his mind was usually focused like a blade, whereas today, his thoughts were all over the place. He'd known for a while that Shahar didn't feel the same way about him as he'd felt about her. In her eyes, he'd forever remain a bumbling youth. And while he didn't understand the apparent relationship that seemed to be forming between her and Jack, he didn't particularly begrudge it either. Shahar had always been unique among the village women, and it made sense that her relationships would be every bit as unique. What confused Lonthal was Jack himself. He seemed friendly and sympathetic one moment, then borderline hostile the next. Lonthal would be tempted to blame it on Jack simply being fickle or petty in nature, but there were no other indications of it other than his occasional behavior towards Lonthal. He even seemed more forgiving of Arthon and his two thugs than he was of Lonthal. Maybe it wasn't a question of forgiveness. You can only forgive someone who's not actively threatening you. So perhaps Jack saw Lonthal as an active threat for some reason? Lonthal was finally catching up to his prey again. He was close enough to taste the churlish with a flick of his tongue. Creeping slowly closer, he readied his spear and started to brace himself for the leap that would claim his prize when he snapped a twig he hadn't realized was beneath his feet. The churlish reacted instantly, leaping away to safety and forcing Lonthal to continue his hunt further still. In frustration, Lonthal punched a rather large rock formation and succeeded only in hurting his hands before continuing. It wasn't fair. Lonthal had been nothing but friendly towards Jack. It wasn't his fault Lord Angles had chosen him to keep an eye on the outpost. At the time, he'd just been eager to be involved in the exciting new adventure. He hadn't realized this was all done without Jack's knowledge or understanding until they'd already been underway. Even then, Jack had seemed to agree with Lonthal's take on the situation and was relatively friendly most of the time. It seemed to come out of nowhere when Jack suddenly became hostile from time to time. It always seemed to be regarding the new Argoon living with him, Emerald. He didn't think Jack had taken her as a mate, as the energy between Jack and the young girl was completely different from him and Shahar. He was acting less like a partner and more like a herd leader. Now that Lonthal thought about it like that, things started to make sense. Argoon were more small pack oriented. Their loyalty was first and foremost directed towards their immediate family. They could form friendships and live civilly with other families, but that came about only because of necessity. There were far too many dangers in the world for a single family to deal with on their own. Then came the discovery that with more people came the ability to specialize, which increased everyone's prosperity. Herd animals were different, though. The adults lived in large communities, creating safety in numbers, and calves were often looked after by every adult. What if Jack saw Emerald as a calf in his herd and saw Lonthal as a predator eyeing Emerald? As he approached the churlish this time, everything fell into place. He'd approached from downwind. His feet found purchase on the soft, silent ground. His weapons were ready, and he leapt. The churlish didn't have time to do more than grunt in surprise as his spear found its mark. The camp would eat well tonight. Lonthal had just started field dressing his catch when the earth shook, as though the gods were pouring their wrath upon the land. He hid behind a rock, but readied his spear for whatever was coming. He knew he had little hope against anything that could shake the very ground itself, but if it found him, this hunter would not cower and wait for his death. At the very least, he'd meet it with a spear in hand. As the moments passed, the sound grew louder, and the shaking grew worse. Whatever was causing this must be titanic. The hunter slowly moved towards what seemed to be the epicenter of the noise and vibrations, closer to the mountain. That's when Lonthal spotted a portion of the mountain heaving and splitting. Something was digging through the very mountain itself. The only thing Lonthal could think of that could do that was the dragon. The hunter kept his spear in hand, just in case, but peered over his rock, determined to catch a glimpse of the mysterious beast. Bursting from the ground was a towering figure, but it wasn't quite as large as Lonthal had expected. It was bipedal and stood roughly 9 to 10 feet tall. It seemed to have large metallic-looking bones on the outside, and in the middle was what appeared to be a stone-skinned form that struck Lonthal as oddly familiar. In its hands was a large round device covered in odd teeth that slowly spun in a continuous circle. The dragon slowly walked out of its new cave entrance before setting down the large device and sitting down. The stone center extracted itself from the metal bones before dusting itself off, revealing itself to be covered in cloth rather than stone. Taking off its armored head and speaking in an oddly familiar voice, the dragon said something in that odd sing-song language the hunter had gotten to know over the last couple of months. Lonthal was so surprised he didn't even bother to stay hidden. Standing there, his spear forgotten, his mouth gaping in astonishment, Jack could hardly miss the hunter. Turning back, Jack said something over his shoulder into the hole he'd dug. The hunter was speechless a moment longer when another familiar voice echoed up from the cave.
"Did you say Lonthal was out there? What's he doing on this side of the mountain?"
Shahar followed her voice out of the cave, dusting herself off and removing a mask of her own. Lonthal finally closed his mouth with a snap, then opened and closed it a few more times before his voice finally came out.
I was having trouble with the hunt that brought me over this way. It's back that way."
Lonthal pointed a bit behind himself, but his eyes refused to leave Jack and the metal skeleton behind him. Jack looked over at the Churlish before returning his gaze to Lonthal, Shahar translating as usual. "Well, I suppose that's just the luck of the draw for you. No way either of us could have anticipated bumping into each other out here. The good news is that we can get you back into the camp via a much more direct route, rather than having to carry the carcass all the way around the mountain again. All I'll ask in payment is that you don't mention or enter the cave without our permission, now that you know about it." Lonthal stood there a moment before processing what Jack had said. Finally, he pushed himself to voice the question in his mind.
Are you the dragon?"
Jack threw back his head and laughed. "No, afraid not. The dragon is a lot bigger than the machine you saw me using, and a lot scarier. She's made that thing for me to help her dig out the mountain a little more. You could say she's a bit cramped in there at the moment. The idea of something bigger and scarier than a machine that could effortlessly dig its way through a mountain was something Lonthal was having trouble grasping. Shahar also seemed concerned, though about something different.
"Are you sure you want to take him into the caves?"
Jack seemed to shrug, dislodging an impressive layer of dust. He gave a rather lengthy explanation to Shahar that Lonthal couldn't follow before turning his head back to Lonthal. Shahar resumed translation. "So how about it? You get a quicker trip back, and you don't run out of heat on the way back, forcing us to send out a rescue party. In return, you give me your word that you won't go into the caves uninvited?" The hunter had utterly lost track of time. He wasn't used to having a limited time to go out and hunt. He'd often go out for days at a time, but that wouldn't work with the heated coats. He found himself embarrassed at his oversight, and it expressed itself in his voice as he spoke.
Yes, I'd appreciate the shortcut. And I swear to never enter the caves unless invited."
Jack gave him a big, toothy grin. Lonthal couldn't help but notice how flat his teeth were, much like a herd animal's would be. "Don't worry about it, man. New tech takes getting used to. I'm just glad we didn't have to track you down before dinner." Something occurred to the hunter as he tilted his head in curiosity.
"Will we pass by the dragon while we're in the caves?"
Jack shook his head. "Nah, we'll be taking a more direct route. There are so many natural caves in there that we won't have to pass... There are so many natural caves in there that we won't have to pass anywhere near the den. No worries." As he gathered up his prey and ready to enter into the caves, Lonthal couldn't help but appreciate that he seemed to be back on sound footing with Jack again. More evidence that his theory was correct. Jack reached out and activated something on his head, resulting in a light shooting out in front of him into the cave. Not so long ago, this would have astounded Lonthal, but after the last 30 minutes, that seemed to be the least surprising thing Jack was capable of. As he followed the smaller man into the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder to himself a little. What would it be like to be part of a larger group, a herd, one where everyone looked out for everyone else, rather than just tolerating each other? It sounded nice.